Hi, friends, it's Sarah, the Fat Culture Critic. And sometimes I like to pair talking about serious subject matter with kind of a silly aesthetic, kind of like Doctor Who. So, obviously, I'm here to talk about Dot and Bubble. This episode is written by Russell T Davies and directed by Dylan Holmes Williams. It tells the story of Lindy Pepperbean, a rich white girl living in Fine Time, an apparent utopia where everybody's life is lived inside a social media bubble. One day, the Doctor and Ruby intrude into her bubble to try and save her from giant slugs that are eating everyone in the colony. She's able to escape Fine Time with the help of her idol, Ricky September, who she ultimately turns on to save herself. And when she meets up with the rest of the people the Doctor and Ruby are trying to rescue, the group of colonists refuse to leave with the Doctor because, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, depending on who you are, the colonists are white supremacists. And no matter what the Doctor says, they only see him as black. This is overall a great episode. And I think that it's one that really needs to be unpacked and thoughtfully discussed, because some of the discourse I've seen around this episode is a bit oversimplifying some important things, which happens, and because whenever there are depictions of racism, often the discourse is about whether this is the way to talk about racism. Is this nuanced story with complicated white people the right way? Or is this blunt confrontation the right way? Should we be seeing through this character's perspective or that character's perspective? And here's the thing, racism is a huge topic. It is a thing that is woven into every aspect of Western culture, of the hegemony. It's like the gravity caused by the weight of history. It's always in the room with us, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. It's never going to be one story or one type of story that is the way to do this. There's never going to be a right way. But what stories can do very well is cover a few aspects or one piece. And we have to be aware that we are unpacking one piece of a larger puzzle. That's why we have to be thoughtful about how we're discoursing, to know that this is one story. And what this particular story does really well, I think, is that this ultimately is a story about whiteness. And when I say whiteness or white people, I'm not talking about people with fair complexions or people of European descent, but there have always been people with pale complexions, and I have a pale complexion, but I'm light-skinned Arab. I'm not actually white, because white is not a color. It is a constructed idea that classifies people based on their ancestry and on things like skin color and various features that are associated with Europeanness. It is this whole complicated sort of creation of this ideology of this thing, which is ultimately it's about power and who has power and who is seen as the right hands to have power. It grew out of people having power who wanted an ideology to say that it is right that they have power. This construction of whiteness has been developed over a number of centuries, particularly through the development of the slave trade and colonialism and eugenics. You have things like scientific racism, where they began with the idea that obviously white people are superior. So now what are the things about white people and how does that make them superior? The conclusion was drawn before the work was ever started. So the supremacy existed, and whiteness was developed to perpetuate the supremacy. It is as constructed as the utopian bubble world of Fine Time. And what we see in Lindy's bubble is not just whiteness, but aspirational whiteness, as opposed to poor whiteness, which has some aspects of power, but not others. And so therefore, so to identify with the whiteness as a possibility of maybe someday reaching the aspirational version, the affluent version. Because the whiteness presented here is affluent and exclusive. This is the tippy top of the hierarchy. Not only is everyone white, they are all thin, they are all able-bodied, they are correctly whiting. And they are correctly womaning, although there is a certain amount of gender queerness, but I think that's to give us a little bit of a misdirect here. But also, queerness can sometimes be very white. Like, the only diversity we actually see in this world, this constructed world, is hair color and a little bit of fashion choices. Even then, the fashion choices are very, very similar. And when it comes to the hair color, the blondes do appear to have the higher following count. So what's presented is a bright, shining, sanitized world where no one and nothing that would darken things is allowed. Gives a sort of a positivity vibe, but it gives a pleasant vibe, a niceness, but kind of surface and hollow. I mean, bubble. And the colors are very soap bubbly. It's very surface, very light, but no depth here. And it doesn't feel real. And it's also a very isolated world, isolated, insulated, individualist. And replaces community with sort of reflections of oneself and sort of the idea of community, or the follower count, not community. It's something often attributed to social media that we say it fosters isolation, but it doesn't have to. It can be a tool of community building and connection, but only if you've learned those skills before trying to use them. You have to learn those skills to build community. And the fine time people, they don't have those skills. Lindy has never hugged someone before. She doesn't even know how to walk without the bubble directing her. It's a science fiction allegory, so everything is very, very literal. But what it's literalizing is something that we do find in the ideology of whiteness that we see in the world, the sort of individualism and hierarchical thinking that comes in particularly neoliberalism of the current iteration, and a sort of navel gaziness. These are goop people. That's how we would see them in this generation. They're the people who would have every color of Stanley Cup, but they would have possessions but not community. I like that the music they use as well is the happy-go-lucky polka dot bikini song is very 1950s, which also be giving us a clue about the kind of world that this is, but not one that you would immediately trigger. So this is an allegorical representation of something, of the ideology of whiteness, which is a bubble that affects a lot of people in the world. In fact, it impacts in one way or another most of us, even if we aren't aware of it, even if we aren't the aspirational version. And how indoctrinated into the bubble of whiteness you are probably affects how you saw this episode. Myself, I had an interesting experience of it. You see, as I said, I'm not white. I'm a light-skinned Arab person with a Western accent. So I am in a lot of proximity to whiteness, but I always am on the outside of it. I live on the edge of the bubble. So I have a sort of particular perspective on the bubble from being near it, but not in it. So in my experience of watching this episode, I clocked a little more of what was going on than some of the folks I've heard from who are more, shall we, more not just in proximity, but in whiteness. But then I have heard from other people who are not in proximity to whiteness who had this clocked right away what was going on. So our perspective really shapes how we see this episode. And I personally, I wasn't sure if they were actually going to go where they went, and I wasn't sure if they were going to land it. But I think they did. And our viewing of this episode can also be shaped, I think, by how a lot of us are more used to the more obvious depictions of racism, the ones that sort of center around hatred and violence and anger. I think a lot of us are used to depictions that are either hate, just obvious out and out hate, or very specific unconscious microaggressions that we've learned to recognize to try and deprogram ourselves from. But what we see from Lindy isn't either of those. She doesn't hate the doctor. And her bias isn't unconscious. What she displays is disdain, disgust, which is different from hate. What I noticed most about her responses was it appeared something unpleasant had invaded her bubble. And I'm not talking about the slugs. The way that she looked at the doctor was as if he was an unpleasant thing that was entering her space. A thing, not a person. That absolute conviction that he is beneath her, that he is not a person, is a little different than the way we tend to see racism in terms of hate and wanting to harm. She only seems to want to harm him when she's like, there won't be consequences. It is a more all-consuming, just absolute conviction that he is a thing and she is a person. And I noticed that because I kind of know what that looks like. I have seen what it looks like when people who made assumptions based purely on the lightness and accent that I have, and then suddenly realize that I'm not actually their sort of person. And the change that you can actually see. When I become the thing that is spoiling the pleasant sameness of their world, and they're still be polite about it, because politeness for a certain type of people is something that they're committed to holding us as much as possible because they see themselves as nice, good people, as I think Lindy does. But it is a pretense, and this is something I experienced a lot while living in Britain. It's a very British experience. And Canada too. And it is from people who are invested into appearing a certain kind of niceness, pleasantness of their whiteness. Well, that's kind of what we see in Fine Time. I mean, they give a very Gen Z aesthetic to it, which is quite clever bit of disarming us, because I think if they had gone for pure waspiness, we would have noticed. Like, these are the people who would have been called wasps, which, if you've never heard, it's white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And they're the kind of people who ran country clubs with unwritten but strictly enforced rules about what kinds of people were acceptable. The kind who would assume that they had the right to rule other people's lands, not out of hatred, but because they simply didn't see those other people as people. I'm looking at you, Churchill. It's a sort of attitude that creates massive famine, because why shouldn't they take the food? They are the people, and those other ones are not, If they don't see them as people, why should they care? And if you don't spot it, you might end up voting. And it's not to say that the hatred kind of racism doesn't exist. It very much does. We need it in our stories because there are Nazis in the streets.
Can I get a hell yeah?
But the Nazis are easy to spot. You know, the black shirts were always easy to spot. The people who enabled them, not so much. And it's harder to spot that polite disdain and the absolute conviction that they're of superiority if it isn't directed at you. If these type of people, if the Lindys of the world, the fine time people, see you as a person, they don't see your friend as a person, you might not notice that they don't see your friend as a person. Might end up voting for them. And if you don't learn to spot the polite disdain, then you might be surprised when the politeness drops. And honestly, I sat up and applauded when the conclusion of this episode was as blunt with the dropping of the politeness and brutal with it as it was. I didn't expect that they were actually going to land it that well. Like I said, I had, but I hadn't expected them to really go there, and they did. Full marks to Millie's reactions, very subtly done, and to the writing and the direction here that kept everything focused on Gawa and what he was doing, because he played the hell out of that scene. And about the Doctor's desperation to save these people. I found myself thinking about the Ninth Doctor and the scene in the Doctor Dances.
Everybody lives, Rose. Just this once. Everybody lives.
Because, like, to me, I think the essence of the Doctor to me is he's, I mean, I read him as autistic, but he is this weird little guy or girl who kind of has humans as their special interests, and they really, really want to save everyone. He of course he can't. That's why the Everybody Lives is so amazing, because for once, in the way that Christopher Eccleston plays that for once, but he will always try to save all that he can. But this time, it's different. They won't let him. And not because he can't, or because of any sensible thing happening, but just because they can't see him as anything but black. And though they don't see him as a person, and they just see his color. They just see him as not them, as not a person. And this is the first time in his memory that the Doctor has been non-white. When Martha pointed out to him that people would judge her for her blackness, he brushed it off, right?
Not exactly white, in case you haven't noticed.
I'm not even human. Just walk about like you own the place. It works for me.
And in this moment, it didn't work. Because for the first time in his memory, he lacks the one thing he never even thought about. It's outside the bubble of whiteness. Because the protection of it is there, even if you aren't the aspirational fine time people. There is still the protection from power if you are still seen. If power still sees you as a person. And for the first time, people didn't see him as such. And this is the sort of story you would be hard to tell in any genre that wasn't sci-fi, right? Or fantasy. Because there's no other circumstance where an adult person with, life and memories and a fully formed personhood finds themselves in a body that is differently racialized than the one they've been in before. Sometimes the context of the racialization changes to something I experienced when the meaning of Arabness changed. But even then, it's nothing like as drastic as this. Most people's first experience of being racialized happens at a young age. And very often, not always, but very often, you have community to help you through it. This story is a science fiction story that maybe you could only do with the Doctor, where all of a sudden he's confronted with the loss of whiteness. Just right there. And it stops him from being able to do the thing that he does, which is help people, which is save people. And this is where I come to my one criticism of this episode, actually. Because it's great. Really, I love it. But I feel like there is another scene that needed to happen. I wish this wasn't where we end. And no, I don't want to see the colonists die. That's not it. I'm not that person. I love the way the cutie plays to the Doctor's pain. But I don't like this episode ending on a Black man's trauma, on a Black man's pain. Too many stories focus on marginalized people's pain and end the story in the pain. Yes, it's important to show those, to show pain and trauma, and I think because they are real and we are telling real stories of life. But where you end a story matters. And we have too much of a tradition of ending in the pain, and that leaves with the impression that the experience is only pain. So the scene that I want is for Doctor and Ruby to go see Carla, to go see the Sundays, Ruby's family. I don't even think it needs dialogue. And I'd certainly, if there was dialogue, it would have to be written by a person who's had this experience, by a Black person. I think we need to end with the Doctor seeking community, especially in contrast to the way in which Lindy is leaving with people, but that's not community. That is not a community. Think the colonists who are going out to colonize. You can see very much that she is alone in a group. Each of them is alone in a group. And I want that contrasted with the Doctor seeking community. Because community is the antidote to the bubble. It is how you survive without it, and how we break down the elements of the ideology of the whiteness that is inside our heads, because this is a bubble that lives inside our heads. It gets inside our heads, and unfortunately we can't just turn it off like Lindy's bubble. We have to do the work to dismantle it. And if we don't, it might not swallow us whole like a big giant slug, but it can destroy the best of us. If we can let any part of that system of thinking that some people are more people than other people, any part of the thinking that thinks of other people as things, that destroys the good in ourselves, destroys that spirit of community and that bonding and that thing we need to overcome. I'm filming this during Pride Month, the time when we ideally seek community. But when we look at the Pride discourse, that bullshit ideology of whiteness and hierarchy and also patriarchy, which is all sort of hydras of the same thing, tends to somehow infects our pride discourse. And we start talking about who belongs there and who doesn't, and how to make it look respectable for the people who aren't really interested in us being our full selves, which is what pride is about. Pride is about taking pride in the parts of yourselves that the outside world says should be shamed. Pride is a rage against shame and conformity, and it is a call to community. Because when the queer community has come together, we do beautiful things. And when and so much of the good that the queer community has done by following the lead of non-white people, because they had the tools and shared them. So this Pride Month and every month, we should try to break down our bubbles and seek community wherever we find it, however we find it, including online, because you can actually use these tools to build community. And speaking of finding community online and community building, I'm doing a thing this month. Join us on July 20th, which is the summer solstice, for me and a group of friends, mostly queer, who are going to be reading Midsummer Night's Dream for you. And we are going to be doing it to raise money for Gaza. We're going to find a GoFundMe from Operation Olive Branch that we can try and raise money for to help some folks out who are suffering ultimately because of white supremacy and its particular iteration that is playing out right now. And I would encourage you to check out Operation Olive Branch anyway and donate to folks, and then come join us for the 20th to have a little bit of silly fun in the forest with fairies, to just have some fun together, build community together through shared projects and play to raise money for a good cause. So I hope you will join us. I hope this little discussion of Thought and Bubble was useful or interesting. And I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters as always. Thank you. You are all lovely. You can join them if you like, or there's various other ways to support me and my work. And have a very happy Pride. And don't get eaten by your bubble.